In 1941, the Axis powers had a very specific view of the American worker. Adolf Hitler and his armaments minister, Albert Speer, looked across the Atlantic and saw a mess. They saw a nation paralyzed by the Great Depression. They saw labor unions striking for higher wages. They saw a diverse, multicultural society which, according to Nazi racial theory, could never achieve the unity of purpose required for total war. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, who had lived in the US, warned his superiors about American industry. But the hardliners in Tokyo dismissed him. They believed that Americans were soft. They were merchants obsessed with profit and comfort. They are a degenerate democracy, the Axis propaganda proclaimed. They cannot accept discipline. They cannot work 16-hour days. German engineering was built on the concept of the Meister, the master craftsman. Building a ship in Germany or Japan was an art form. It required highly trained specialists who had apprenticed for years. It required precision riveting, hand-fitting of parts, and meticulous quality control. The Axis leaders believed that you could not mass-produce a warship. A tank, maybe. But a 10,000-ton ocean-going vessel? That required tradition. They looked at the US shipbuilding capacity in 1939 and laughed. It was practically non-existent. The US merchant marine was rotting. Hitler calculated that even if the Americans mobilized, it would take them 5 years to build the shipyards, train the craftsmen, and start producing ships in significant numbers. By then, the U-boats would have starved Britain, and the war would be over. It was a calculation based on the old world way of doing things. They didn't realize that the Americans weren't going to use old world methods. They weren't going to build ships like craftsmen. They were going to build them like cars. And they weren't going to use master craftsmen. They were going to use housewives, farmers, and musicians. The Axis mocked the rabble of the American workforce. They didn't know that this rabble was about to outproduce the entire combined industrial output of Europe and Asia. The man who revolutionized shipbuilding had never built a ship in his life. Henry J. Kaiser was a construction magnate. He built roads. He built dams, including the Hoover and Grand Gully. He poured concrete. When the war started, the US government was desperate for ships. The British were begging for tonnage to replace what the U-boats were sinking. Kaiser looked at the problem with fresh eyes. The traditional shipbuilders told the Navy, you lay the keel. You build the frame. You rivet the plates. It takes 6 months. Kaiser said, that's too slow. Let's prefabricate. Kaiser treated a ship like a building. He didn't see a hull, he saw a series of steel boxes welded together. He proposed building the Liberty ship, a simple, ugly cargo hauler, using construction techniques, not naval architecture techniques. He bought mudflats in Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon. He built massive yards. But they didn't look like shipyards. They looked like assembly plants. There were vast open spaces for storing steel. There were railway lines running everywhere. Kaiser's philosophy was simple, don't wait for the keel to be laid. Start building the deckhouse now. Start building the bow now. Start building the engine room now. Build them all at the same time, in different parts of the yard. Then, bring them together and weld them up. The naval establishment was horrified. They thought Kaiser was a cowboy. They said his ships would break, and some did, initially. But Kaiser had one metric that mattered: speed. He promised to cut the build time from roughly 240 days to, well, he didn't set a limit. He just said faster. The Axis spies watching these developments reported that a concrete pourer was trying to build ships. Berlin had a good laugh. Let the American road builder try to float his concrete, they joked. They didn't realize that Kaiser wasn't building ships for posterity. He was building them for the war. He famously said, "I am not building a ship. I am building a delivery system for cargo." The technical secret to the American speed was the shift from rivets to welds. Riveting is slow. It requires 3 men, a heater, a holder, and a hitter. It is physically exhausting. And crucially, you have to do it on the ship. Welding is faster. One person with an electric torch can fuse steel plates. But welding overhead, lying on your back, looking up, is hard. Molten metal drips on you. The weld is often weak. Kaiser's engineers solved this with downhand welding. Because they were prefabricating the ship in sections, they could flip the sections over. They mounted giant jigs, massive rotating frames, that could hold a 50-ton deck section. The workers would weld the plates while standing comfortably, looking down. Gravity helped the metal flow into the joint. It was easier. It was faster. And it meant you could train a novice to do it in 2 weeks. This opened the door to a new workforce: women. Wendy the welder became the icon of the shipyards. Women, who were thought to be too weak for heavy riveting guns, proved to be excellent welders. They had steady hands and patience. They swarmed over the steel sections, laying miles of bead. The Germans were stuck in their dogma. They believed a woman's place was in the home, Kinder, Küche, Kirch. They refused to mobilize their female population for heavy industry until it was too late. They relied on slave labor, which was often sabotaged or inefficient due to starvation. The Americans unleashed the other 50% of their population. While a German shipyard was limited by the number of skilled male riveters available, an American shipyard was limited only by the number of welding torches they could plug into the wall. The downhand technique meant that American ships were being stitched together at a speed that defied European comprehension. The sparks flying in Richmond and Baltimore were the signals of a production revolution. The Richmond shipyards in California became the most productive industrial facility on Earth. It wasn't just a yard, it was a machine. Kaiser set up a flow of materials that stretched across the continent. Steel came from Pittsburgh. Engines came from Ohio. When the materials arrived at the yard, they entered a 7-mile assembly line. The steel plates were cut by automatic torches. They moved on rollers to the sub-assembly bays. There, they were welded into bulkheads, deck sections, and bow units. These units, some weighing 100 tons, were lifted by massive cranes. Kaiser built the biggest cranes in the world. He didn't want to lift a plate, he wanted to lift a room. The cranes would carry the sections to the slipway. The hull would come together like a giant 3D puzzle. Engineers didn't measure in inches, they measured in tolerances of fit. If a piece didn't fit, they cut it or filled the gap with weld. It was rough. It was dirty. But it was fast. The yard operated 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. At night, the yard was lit by thousands of floodlights. It looked like a city on fire. The noise was deafening. But the output was miraculous. In 1941, it took about 244 days to build a Liberty ship. By 1944, the average was 42 days. 3 ships were being launched every single day across the U.S. shipbuilding network. That is a new 10,000-ton ship hitting the water every 8 hours. The Axis strategists had calculated that they could sink 50 ships a month. The Americans were building 90. The 7-mile assembly line had defeated the U-boat before the ships even left the harbor. The Germans were fighting a war of attrition against a multiplication table. They were trying to empty a bathtub while the Americans were filling it with a fire hose. And the tap was controlled by a man who used to pave roads. In November 1942, Henry Kaiser decided it was time to make a point. The Axis propaganda was still claiming that American production figures were inflated. They said the ships were slow to build and poorly made. Kaiser ordered his Richmond Shipyard No. 2 to break the world record for constructing a ship. The target was the SS Robert E. Peary. It was a stunt, yes. But it was a stunt with a purpose, to show the world what was possible when you ignored the rulebook. The preparation was meticulous. Every piece of steel, every pipe, every engine component was pre-positioned. At 1 minute past midnight on Sunday, November 8, the keel was laid. The clock started ticking. The shipyard was a frenzy of activity. Thousands of workers swarmed the slipway. Because of prefabrication, they weren't building a ship from the bottom up, they were snapping it together. Huge 50-ton sections of the double-bottom hull were lowered into place and welded instantly. By the end of day 1, the entire hull was taking shape. On day 2, the massive steam engine, already assembled and tested on the dock, was lowered into the engine room. On day 3, the deckhouse and masts were added. The ship was painted while the welders were still working on the interior. The German intelligence officers reading the daily reports must have thought their spies were drunk. Ship 50% complete in 24 hours. Impossible. But on day 4, a Thursday, November 12, the impossible happened. Just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the keel was laid, the Robert E. Peary slid down the ways into the water. It was 90% complete. The fitting out took another few days, but the hull was floating. The news went around the world. It was a psychological hammer blow. Admiral Donitz realized that if the Americans could build a ship in 4 days, he could never win the tonnage war. Even if he sank a ship every hour, he couldn't keep up. The 4-day ship wasn't the standard, the average settled around 42 days, but it proved that the upper limit of production was defined only by imagination and organization, not by tradition. The Axis leadership suffered from a cognitive dissonance regarding American production. They refused to believe the numbers. When reports came in that the US built 8 million tons of shipping in 1942 and 19 million tons in 1943, Hitler dismissed them. "It is Jewish propaganda," he raged. "No nation can do that." The Japanese were equally skeptical. Their own shipbuilding industry was artisanal, slow, and resource-starved. They calculated American capacity based on their own metrics. They assumed a certain number of man-hours per ton. But the American man-hour was different. It was an assembly line hour. A German worker might spend 10 hours fitting a complex valve. An American worker spent 10 minutes bolting on a pre-made, standardized valve. The Axis believed that qualities meant complexity. They looked at the Liberty ship and saw a crude, ugly box. They assumed it wouldn't work. They didn't understand that in logistics, quantity is quality. 1,000 ugly ships that arrive on time are infinitely better than 10 beautiful ships that arrive next year. This denial led to strategic paralysis. Because they didn't believe the numbers, the Axis didn't change their strategy. They continued to fight a war of attrition they had already lost. They didn't realize that the American economy wasn't just mobilized, it had been transformed into a new kind of industrial organism. By the time they accepted the truth, when the horizon was filled with Liberty ships carrying an invasion force, it was too late. The propaganda numbers had become steel reality. The secret weapon of the American shipyards wasn't just the welding torch, it was the people holding it. The war forced a social revolution in the United States. Before the war, heavy industry was a white man's world. But with millions of men drafted into the military, the shipyards faced a labor crisis. Kaiser and the Maritime Commission opened the gates. They hired women. Not just for clerical work, but for heavy labor. Wendy the welder joined Rosie the riveter. Women proved to be meticulous, reliable workers, often producing cleaner welds than men. They hired African Americans. Thousands of black workers moved from the rural South to the West Coast shipyards in the Great Migration. They faced segregation and discrimination, yes, but they also found high-paying jobs and a chance to contribute. They hired the elderly and the disabled. The shipyard workforce was a melting pot. It was messy, chaotic, and vibrant. Contrast this with the German approach. Germany refused to mobilize women until the very end of the war. The Nazi ideology demanded that women stay home and produce children for the Reich. Instead, they relied on slave labor. Millions of forced laborers from occupied Europe worked in German factories. They were starving, beaten, and sabotaged the work whenever they could. A slave has no incentive to build a good tank. A free worker, earning a good wage and fighting for their country, does. The American shipyards were powered by patriotism and paychecks. Workers bought war bonds with their wages. They took pride in their ships. This morale was a tangible asset. The Axis had underestimated the power of a free, diverse workforce. They thought diversity was weakness. The shipyards proved that diversity was strength. It provided a labor pool so deep that production never stopped, shift after shift, year after year. The logistical genius of the Liberty ship program lay in its geography. Ships are usually built on the coast. But the materials for the Liberty ships came from everywhere. It was a nationwide puzzle. The boilers were built in Tennessee. The winches in Arkansas. The anchors in Pennsylvania. Over 32,000 factories across the United States were involved. This was distributed manufacturing. If a factory in Ohio was bombed, impossible, but hypothetically, another factory in Indiana could pick up the slack. The parts were shipped by rail to the shipyards. The organization required to coordinate this was immense. Every part had to arrive at the right time. You can't install the engine if the engine mounts haven't arrived. The U.S. Maritime Commission managed this flow with punch-card computers and an army of clerks. It was the precursor to modern just-in-time logistics. The prefabrication went down to the hull sections. Factories in Denver, a mile high and 1,000 miles from the ocean, were building sections of ships. These huge steel chunks were loaded onto flatbed trains and shipped through the Rockies to the West Coast. The Germans could not bomb these factories. They were too far away. The American industrial base was immune to attack. The Axis powers were fighting a war where their factories were on the front line. The American factories were on another planet, economically speaking. The prefabrication puzzle meant that the entire continent of North America was essentially one giant shipyard. The coast was just the assembly point. The Axis strategists looked at the map and saw oceans separating America from the war. They didn't realize that those oceans were actually highways connecting the arsenal to the front. The miracle of the all-welded ship was not without its teething problems. In fact, it almost caused a catastrophic failure of the entire program. Welding is fast, but it creates immense locked-in stresses in the steel plates. As the molten metal cools, it shrinks, pulling against the surrounding plates. In the warm waters of the Pacific or the Gulf of Mexico, this wasn't a major issue. But when the Liberty ships sailed into the freezing North Atlantic in winter, disaster struck. Cold makes steel brittle. Suddenly, reports started coming in of ships breaking apart at sea, sometimes without even being hit by a torpedo. A sailor would hear a sound like a cannon shot, a massive crack. A fracture would start in a hatch corner and propagate instantly around the entire hull, snapping the ship in two. The Axis propagandists rejoiced. The American junk ships are falling apart, Tokyo Rose broadcasts claimed. They believed their assessment of shoddy American mass production was finally being proven correct. It was a crisis. If the ships couldn't survive cold water, the supply line to Russia, the Murmansk Run, and Britain would be severed. The response of the Maritime Commission was characteristic of the American approach. They didn't stop production, they engineered a fix on the fly. They realized that the continuous welded seams allowed a crack to travel uninterrupted. The solution was the crack arrestor. They brought back the rivet for a specific purpose. They installed heavy steel straps along the deck and hull, riveted into place. If a crack started in the welded section, it would hit the riveted strap and stop. The rivets allowed for a tiny bit of flex that broke the tension. Existing ships were retrofitted in days. New ships had the straps built in. The crisis was solved not by abandoning the new technology, but by understanding it. The Axis hoped the flaws would doom the effort. Instead, the Americans learned from the failures and made the system robust. By 1943, the industrial machine was running so smoothly that the US could afford the luxury of improvement. The Liberty ship was always intended as an emergency stopgap. It was ugly, the ugly duckling, FDR called it. It was crude. Worst of all, it was slow. Its obsolete steam piston engine, chosen because it was easy to manufacture, gave it a top speed of only 11 knots. It was a sitting duck for a 17-knot U-boat on the surface. But as the engine factories caught up, the Maritime Commission decided it was time for an upgrade. They introduced the Victory ship. It looked similar, but it was a different beast. It was slightly longer and wider, but crucially, it had a modern steam turbine engine. Its top speed was 15 to 17 knots. This was a game changer. A Victory ship could outrun a submerged U-boat and even challenge one on the surface. The genius of the transition was that it didn't stop the assembly lines. The shipyards, now masters of prefabrication, simply adjusted their jigs and templates. They phased out the Liberties and phased in the Victories without a massive drop in output. While Germany and Japan were struggling to build any merchant ships to replace their losses, the United States was already moving on to the second generation of its mass-produced fleet. The Axis were fighting yesterday's war, American industry was already building for tomorrow. By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was over. It wasn't won solely by destroyers and aircraft, it was won by accountants. It was a war of tonnage. The Germans knew they had to sink ships faster than the Allies could build them. For a while in 1942, they did. But by late 1943, the graph had flipped dramatically. The U-boats were sinking perhaps 300,000 tons a month, but American shipyards were launching over 1,500,000 tons a month. It was a deluge. A tsunami of steel. In total, the United States built 2,710 Liberty ships. Add in the Victory ships, tankers, and military transports, and the U.S. produced over 50 million deadweight tons of shipping during the war. It was more tonnage than the entire pre-war merchant fleets of Britain, Japan, and Germany combined. The Axis admirals who scoffed at American shipyards were eventually drowned in production. U-boat captains on patrol would look through their periscopes and see convoys that stretched from horizon to horizon, with new Liberty ships extending as far as the eye could see. They realized the futility of their mission. For every ship they sank, 3 more appeared to take its place. The American industrial base had turned the ocean into a conveyor belt that the Axis could not break. When the war ended, the world was awash in Liberty ships. They were designed with a 5-year lifespan. They were meant to be disposable, used up in the war and then scrapped. But they were built too well. Thousands survived. They became the backbone of the post-war global economy. They carried the grain that fed a starving Europe. They carried the coal and machinery of the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Germany and Japan. They were the unwitting fathers of globalization. The sheer volume of standardized ships standardized the world's ports and trade routes. Eventually, they grew old. They became too slow and expensive to run. Hundreds were anchored in ghost fleets in places like Suisun Bay, California, and the James River in Virginia. For decades, they sat there, rusting in silent rows, a strategic reserve in case World War III broke out. Slowly, they were towed away to be scrapped, their steel recycled into new cars and buildings. Today, only a handful remain as floating museums, like the SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco. When you walk their decks, they feel crude and industrial. They smell of old oil and history. They are not beautiful ships in the way a vintage ocean liner is beautiful. But they are beautiful in their purpose. The Axis powers mocked them as cheap, mass-produced junk built by unskilled labor. But that junk delivered the soldiers, the tanks, the fuel, and the food that liberated 2 continents. The Liberty ship proved that in a total war, the most powerful weapon wasn't the biggest gun or the fastest plane. It was the ability to build the same simple thing over and over again, faster than the enemy could destroy it.